Encounter is brought to you by the Broome County Council of Churches, where we connect compassion with needs as we inspire growth with dignity. You'll find us in special places throughout the community. For those who remain hungry, we provide meals. For those who are challenged, we build wheelchair ramps. We comfort those who are ill, minister to those who are confined, and we remain an advocate for change and understanding on behalf of every element of our community. Connect and inspire. Encounter the Broome County Council of Churches.
Good morning and welcome to Encounter. I'm your host today, Joe Sellepack. I'm the Executive Director at the Broome County Council of Churches. One of my favorite movies is Robin Williams' Dead Poets Society, and in that movie he's a teacher, and he puts his entire class through a whole mess of little lessons around poetry. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting is when he was asked, well, you know, what is the purpose of language? He said, well, of course, the purpose of language is to woo women. Of course, that's pretty funny on one level, but it's also, language is meant to communicate something. And one of the ways that we communicate with language is through the art of poetry. Poetry, for me, is almost a daily practice. I read a poem almost every day. And what is it about poetry that really speaks to us?
Well, I think it's funny that you start with Dead Poets Society and this idea of wooing women, right?
Right.
In my life, you know, when I first met my wife, one of the first things I did was I wrote her a poem before we had even gone on a date, and I read her it, and that's not a very good strategy for getting a date, but it seemed to work out.
Right. Why write poetry? I mean, one of the reasons, obviously, is that we want to attract someone. We want to communicate something. We want to, and one of the things I love about poetry is that it kind of condenses language down, right? So you can say something in a poem that you wouldn't necessarily say in any other form, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think of the beginning of E.M. Forster's novel, Howard's End, that has that epigram, only connect. That's
right.
Really what poetry for me is all about. And, you know, there's so many different types of poetry. It's not a thing that's monolithic. There are poems that are, you know, very difficult to read. There are poems that rhyme. There are poems that don't even sound like poems but are poems. And so the question is, what makes a poem a poem? Wallace Stevens says a poem is something, or poetry must resist the intelligence almost successfully. And that's an interesting idea. Robert Frost says that poetry is a momentary stay against confusion, and that a poem should begin in delight and end in wisdom. And you can go through, you know, all of the great poets and even some of the not so great poets, and you can hear these ideas about what poetry is and what it can do. For me, it's a necessity. It's something that is part of who I am. It's something that I've been doing since I was about 18 or 19, regularly, and it's something that comes directly from my love of reading. Really, that's what makes me want to write. Besides the fact that I just have this inherent desire to write, and it's part of my daily practice as a human being, it's something that helps me to understand the work of the poets that I admire and who've shaped my understanding of the world we live in. You know, when I was 18 or 19, I stumbled upon the writings of three poets: Gerard Manley Hopkins, the Jesuit priest, Victorian poet, whose poetry is intensely musical and way ahead of its time, and violently beautiful, and you know, really sacred and interesting and wild, you know, the way he writes about the natural world. And then also Rainer Maria Rilke, the German poet. Rilke. His poem, The Archaic Torso of Apollo, which ends with the great phrase, "You must change your life."
Exactly.
And also the American poet Allen Ginsberg, whose Howl what really blew me away at 18 or 19 years old, writing all of this about all of these adventures, combining the sacred with the profane, writing in this tradition that begins with the King James Bible and stretches through Whitman and Christopher Smart and William Blake, and this kind of prophetic consciousness in everyday American life. These poets made me want to write, and they made me want to understand the world through the medium of poetry in the same way that they did.
My guest today is Dante Stefano. Dante is you're a teacher at Union Endicott High School, but you just did your dissertation on poetry, right? You want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I did my PhD at Binghamton University, which is where I did my undergraduate work and my MAT for teaching. I've been teaching at UE High School for the past 10 years. I also teach creative writing classes at Binghamton University as an adjunct. And while I was at Binghamton University, I was studying poetry in the creative writing department and writing poetry, and also researching different schools of poetry, different types of poetry, including the confessional poets of the 1960s, such as Anne Sexton, Sylvia Plath, and John Berryman. And the conclusion of that was a thesis, or a dissertation, which became the book that you hold in your hands, Love is a Stone Endlessly in Flight, which was picked up by a publisher out of Nebraska, Bright Horse Books, affiliated with Creighton University and the University of Nebraska. So I was lucky to have that, and it's a book that's about a lot of different things. It's about Binghamton, it's about my Catholic faith, it's about the death of my father, and it's also about my love of different types of American music, including jazz and blues music. So
it's a beautiful book, well-written book. I loved some of the poetry, especially the ones that emphasize the area. It helped me understand a little bit more about downtown Binghamton at times, even. It's a wonderfully written book. Are there some poems that you would like to pull out and share with us?
Sure. I could read a couple, maybe some poems about Binghamton specifically.
Okay.
And maybe I'll start with the title poem, which has a lot about Binghamton in it, but the title of the poem is Love is a Stone Endlessly in Flight, which is a kind of purposefully misread line from the great long poem by William Carlos Williams called Paterson, which is a poem about the city of Paterson, New Jersey, which is a great city for American poetry because Ginsberg's from there, and Maria Mazziotti Gillen, my mentor, is from there, and also William Carlos Williams traveled through Paterson quite a bit in his rounds as an obstetrician. So this poem Paterson was also important to me because it's a poem that tries to make an epic out of an American city. Right. And in some ways, when I was younger, I was always thinking about Binghamton, New York, and could I write my own Paterson, which is something that you think when you're 18 or 19 years old that you could write this great American poem. And so a lot of my early poems were about walking around Binghamton, observing things, recording them, also thinking about my family life growing up, thinking about these multiple Binghamtons that I've traveled through and experienced living in this area. And so I'll start with this poem, Love is a Stone Endlessly in Flight. Love is a stone endlessly in flight. The great falls strike their silk upon bullheads and trout my father never fished for there. He was about other rivers and falls, about other waters' vagrant currents, calling him home, calling him Dominic, telling stories of a man forever a boy in photographs from the 50s, wearing a cowboy hat with a cap gun cocked in his hand. The Passaic River didn't call him, but the Shenango did. It cut like a glacier through the basalt of millennia. Oh, Paterson, oh, Williams, what I mean to say is just this. My father's people made their way through trades, as dishwashers and factory workers in a city that had no Passaic to buttress it. They and he were always skipping stones in elsewhere rushing eddies, dreaming flocks they wouldn't tend, and orchards full of apples they could never harvest. O rivers of the world, my father died in my arms as I carried him almost to the hospice bed. It was an honor to stoop and cradle him on the threshold of the afterlife, where he, I hope, skips stones with the broken vowels of immigrant angels, holy green waters that roll on forever. When I went to his fresh grave, I wanted to lay down on the flowers and sleep there or hug the dirt, but instead I sifted through the packed soil and found 4 flat pebbles to give them to my mother, because the stone lives, the flesh dies, and we know nothing of death or its mills that churn into a place that is not home. Great Falls, strike your silk upon the bullheads and guide my father to a street lined with linden, where the difficult labor of living is done. O spent shell from the final volley, I hold you in my palm, and I know no metaphor can honor a father. A chance word, Williams said, upon paper may destroy the world. Dear Dad, I write you exact words dictated by the whirlpool that forms at the confluence of other rivers. Yes, love is a stone endlessly in flight.
How many times did that stone skip?
Yeah, I love the metaphor of the stone in flight.
It is beautiful.
And of course in Patterson he's talking about chiseling, the sculptor chiseling pieces from a sculpture and those flying down too, right?
Yeah,
so,
right.
So there's the kind of this is a kind of an ars poetica type thing about art and making and mortality, intertwined there.
Well, the line about you nearly carrying your father to hospice, that was very powerful. For me, that was a very powerful moment in the poem.
Yeah, that's, of course, this is all very autobiographical, and my father had several different types of cancer, and when he wanted to die in his house, so when hospice came, the very day they brought the hospice bed, I was carrying him to the hospice bed, and the nurse had just come, and that's when he died. So, that was kind of the way he would want to die, actually, I think. In a strange way, there was something good about that for him. Although at that moment he was, in the death throes, and he was not, conscious even, really.
Well, as a son, does writing that poem, did that help you process the death of your father?
Oh yeah, I think that definitely. I was writing quite a bit about my father's life and death, after that happened, and I've always written about my father. I find that there's certain people that you can write about in your poetry very easily, and other people that you can't for whatever reason. There has to be some kind of intense emotional connection, but even with people that you have an intense emotional connection, sometimes you can't write. I have written very few poems about my mother, who's a wonderful woman, but for whatever reason I have not written that many poems about her.
Was there not? I've always find that when I'm writing about something, I need to have a hook. So it has to be something that pulls you into it. And from your father, it sounds like maybe his life is more your life too, in a certain way. You think?
I think that there's certain similarities and certain things that I could understand about my own life and how it's unfolded by looking at my father's life. But a father's life is always a mystery to the son, right?
Right.
There's a quote by Sid Corman, what is it? It takes half a lifetime's blindness to see one's father.
Yeah.
So, I have probably lived half a lifetime. And so I'm starting to see certain things about him now. And poetry has helped me to see certain things about him and other people that I love. Certainly about my wife, too, in our relationship. It's kind of helped me to understand who she is and who I am and who we're going to be together in for the rest of our lives,
Right.
So I also I know that you have a poem that you wrote about your wife. Would you want to read it?
Sure, I can read my poem that I wrote to my wife, and this is one of those ones that proves to the axiom that Robin Williams in Dead Poets Society kind of was leading to. So this is about wooing women, and on Valentine's Day, every Valentine's Day, I used to buy Shelley a card, and then in the card I would write a poem or something.